In this 1910 photo of three brothers seems normal until you see the youngest one's fingers. The autumn light filtered through the tall windows of the Pennsylvania Historical Society's archive room, casting long shadows across rows of storage boxes. Elena Hartwell carefully lifted the lid of box 247B, her gloved hands moving with practiced precision. As a photographic conservator, she had examined thousands of images from the early 20th century, but something about this particular collection had drawn her attention. The box contained donations from the estate of a woman named Dorothy, who had passed away 3 months earlier at the age of 96. Among faded receipts and yellowed letters, Elena found a cardboard folder tied with a deteriorating ribbon. Inside lay a formal portrait. 3 young boys posed stiffly against a painted backdrop of columns and drapes, their faces solemn in the way of old photographs when exposure times demanded stillness. The image was dated 1910 on the back, in careful handwriting. Thomas, William, and James. It read. Nothing more. The boys appeared to range in age from perhaps 6 to 12 years old. They wore matching dark suits with high collars, their hair neatly parted and slicked down. The 2 older boys stood on either side, hands resting formally at their sides. The youngest sat in a wooden chair between them, his small hands placed carefully in his lap. Elena set up her magnifying lamp to examine the photograph more closely, a routine part of her documentation process. The image quality was remarkably sharp for its age, the work of a skilled photographer. She noted the details in her conservation log, the texture of the fabric, the ornate chair, the painted backdrop's Victorian styling. Everything seemed typical of studio portraits from that era. But as she moved her magnifier across the youngest boy's face, something made her pause. His expression was different from his brother's. While they stared directly at the camera with the slight tension of trying to remain perfectly still, the smallest boy's gaze seemed unfocused, distant. His face held an unusual smoothness, an almost waxy quality that didn't quite match the natural appearance of his siblings. Elena's breath caught as she moved the magnifier lower, examining the child's hands folded in his lap. The position looked wrong somehow, too perfect, too arranged. She increased the magnification, leaning closer to the illuminated surface. The fingers of his right hand lay across the left in a pose that appeared peaceful at first glance. But as she studied them more carefully, a cold realization began to form in her chest. The angle was impossible for a living child to maintain naturally. Elena pulled back from the magnifier, her heart racing. She had seen enough Victorian-era photographs to recognize certain patterns, certain telltale signs. But she needed to be certain. She retrieved her digital camera and took several high-resolution photographs of the image, then transferred them to her computer. Using specialized software, she zoomed in on the youngest boy's hands until every detail became crystal clear on her screen. The fingers were bent at angles that defied natural muscle tension. The small joints appeared locked in positions that a living 6-year-old could not hold without considerable discomfort, positions that would cause trembling and shifting during the long exposure times required in 1910. Yet the hands showed no blur, no movement whatsoever. They were as sharp and clear as the painted backdrop behind them. Elena enlarged another section of the image, focusing on the boy's collar and neck. There, barely visible in the shadows, she noticed what appeared to be a thin support structure, carefully hidden behind his head. Her stomach tightened. She had read about these supports in her conservation training, had seen examples in academic journals, but had never encountered one in her own work. She sat back in her chair, processing what she was seeing. This was a post-mortem photograph, a memorial portrait taken after death. The practice had been common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially for children who died young. In an era when infant mortality was high and photographs were expensive, families often commissioned a single portrait of their deceased child, sometimes posed with living siblings, to preserve their memory forever. The realization filled Elena with profound sadness. She looked at the faces of the 2 older boys standing on either side of their deceased brother. Now she could see what she had missed before. The grief barely contained in their young faces, the protective way they positioned themselves beside their sibling, the weight of loss visible even through their attempt at formal composure. Elena knew she had stumbled upon something significant. This photograph told a story of love, loss, and the desperate desire to hold on to memory in the only way available. But who were these boys? What had happened to James? And why had this photograph remained hidden in Dorothy's estate for so long, waiting to reveal its heartbreaking secret? Elena spent the rest of that afternoon carefully documenting every detail of the photograph. She measured its dimensions, noted the type of paper and mounting board, and examined the photographer's mark embossed in the lower right corner. Westfield Portrait Studio, Pittsburgh, PA. The studio's ornate logo featured decorative scrollwork typical of the period, giving her a starting point for her research. That evening, in her small apartment above a bookstore in downtown Pittsburgh, Elena couldn't stop thinking about the three brothers. She made herself a cup of tea and opened her laptop, beginning the painstaking work of tracking down information about the Westfield Portrait Studio. Historical business directories from 1910 Pittsburgh were available through the city's digitized archives, and after an hour of searching, she found it. The studio had been located on Fifth Avenue, operated by a photographer named Frederick Westfield from 1897 to 1923. The next morning, Elena requested time away from her regular conservation duties to pursue what she called extended research on a significant historical find. Her supervisor, Dr. Raymond Koslow, was intrigued by her discovery and granted her 2 weeks. He understood the historical importance of postmortem photography and recognized that this image might offer insights into early 20th century mourning practices in Pennsylvania. Elena's first stop was the Carnegie Library's Pennsylvania room, where local history records were meticulously preserved. She requested death certificates and burial records from Pittsburgh and surrounding areas for 1909 and 1910, searching for any boy named James who died around age 6. The librarian, an elderly woman named Grace who had worked there for 40 years, helped her navigate the fragile ledgers. "Post-mortem photographs," Grace said softly, adjusting her glasses as she looked at Elena's printout. "My grandmother had one of her baby sister. They were common once. People needed something to hold on to." Elena nodded, touched by the understanding in Grace's voice. Together they searched through records, finding several boys named James who had died in that period, but none whose ages and family structures matched the photograph. Elena recorded each possibility, knowing she would need to cross-reference with other sources. The search was slow, methodical, and occasionally heartbreaking as she read cause after cause of death: influenza, scarlet fever, accidents. Frustrated by the lack of clear leads, Elena decided to learn more about Dorothy, the woman whose estate had contained the photograph. The donation records at the Historical Society included an address and the name of the executor handling her estate, a lawyer named Robert Kemp. Elena called his office and explained her research. After some initial hesitation about client confidentiality, Kemp agreed to meet with her, curious about what she had discovered. His office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in the Strip District. Robert Kemp was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and an air of patient professionalism. He gestured for Elena to sit across from his broad oak desk, which was covered with neat stacks of legal documents. "Dorothy was a remarkable woman," he said, after Elena explained her discovery. "She lived alone for the last 30 years of her life, never married, no children. She was a retired school teacher, very private. When she passed, I was surprised to be named executor. We'd only met a handful of times over the years." "Do you know anything about her family history?" Elena asked, showing him the photograph on her laptop screen. Robert leaned forward, studying the image carefully. His expression changed as Elena pointed out the details she had discovered about the youngest boy. "I had no idea," he said quietly. Dorothy never spoke about her family. Her apartment was full of books and classical music recordings, but very few personal photographs. "This makes me wonder what she was holding on to." He opened a file on his desk. "I can tell you that Dorothy's full name was Dorothy Brennan. She was born in 1920, which would make her 10 years younger than this photograph. So these boys weren't her brothers. Could they have been her uncles?" Elena suggested. "Or cousins?" "Possibly," Robert said. He pulled out another document. Her parents were listed as Catherine and Joseph Brennan. I have their marriage certificate here from 1918, but I don't have information about their extended families." He paused, looking at Elena with genuine interest. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Elena considered the question. "Because someone loved these boys enough to preserve this photograph for over a century. Because James deserves to be remembered as more than just an anonymous subject in a post-mortem portrait. And because I think there's a story here that needs to be told." With Dorothy's maiden name now known, Elena returned to the archives with renewed focus. She requested church records, census data, and city directories for the Brennan family in early 20th century Pittsburgh. The work was tedious, requiring hours of squinting at microfilm readers and cross-referencing handwritten entries in faded ledgers. On her third day of intensive searching, Elena found something promising. The 1920 census listed Catherine Brennan, age 25, living with her husband Joseph and infant daughter Dorothy on Perry Street in Pittsburgh's North Side. But more importantly, Catherine's place of birth was listed as Pittsburgh, and her parents' names appeared in an earlier census, Patrick and Mary O'Brien. Elena's pulse quickened. She scrolled back through the census records to 1910, searching for the O'Brien family. There they were, Patrick O'Brien, age 42, listed as a steel mill foreman; Mary O'Brien, age 39, and their children, Catherine, age 15, Thomas, age 12, William, age 9, and James, age 6. The names matched. Thomas, William, and James. These were Catherine's brothers, which would make them Dorothy's uncles. Elena sat back from the microfilm reader, her hands trembling slightly. She had found them. The photograph showed Catherine's 3 younger brothers, captured in 1910 when she was 15 years old. But the census also revealed something else. In the 1920 census, only Catherine appeared among the O'Brien children. Thomas and William were no longer listed in the household, presumably grown and living independently, but there was no trace of James in any subsequent records Elena could find. She needed to find James's death certificate. Elena spent the remainder of that afternoon at the Allegheny County Office of Vital Records, searching through death indexes. Finally, she found it. James Patrick O'Brien died March 17, 1910, age 6 years and 4 months. Cause of death, diphtheria. Place of death, family residence, 428 Perry Street. Elena requested a copy of the certificate, and as she waited for it to be processed, she felt the weight of history pressing against her. James had died of diphtheria, a bacterial infection that had been a leading cause of childhood death before vaccines became available. He had died at home, surrounded by family, in an era when such losses were tragically common. Elena needed to understand more about the O'Brien family's life in 1910. She visited the neighborhood where they had lived, walking along Perry Street on a cold November morning. The original houses from that era were mostly gone, replaced by newer construction, but a few Victorian-era buildings remained, their wooden porches and brick facades offering glimpses of what the street had looked like a century ago. At the local Historical Society branch, Elena met with a volunteer named Margaret, who specialized in North Side immigrant history. The O'Briens would have been Irish immigrants or second generation, Margaret explained, spreading old maps across the table. This area was heavily Irish and German in the early 1900s. The men worked in the steel mills, difficult and dangerous jobs. The families were tight-knit, often living several generations in one house. Elena showed Margaret the photograph. The older woman studied it carefully, her expression softening with recognition and sadness. "I've seen photographs like this before. The families couldn't afford multiple portraits, so when a child died, they'd take one final photograph to remember them by. Sometimes they'd pose the deceased child with living siblings, trying to capture one last family moment. Look at the older boys' faces," Margaret continued, pointing to Thomas and William in the photograph. "They know. They understand what's happening. You can see it in their eyes, even though they're trying to be strong for the photograph." Elena looked again at the 2 living brothers. Margaret was right. There was something in their expressions that she hadn't fully recognized before, a mixture of sorrow and protective love. Thomas, at 12, stood with his hand placed gently near James's shoulder, not quite touching, but close. as if maintaining a connection. William, at 9, had positioned himself on the other side, his small face fighting to maintain composure. The photographer would have worked quickly, Margaret said. Post-mortem photographs usually happened within a day or two of death, before burial. The family would have dressed James in his best clothes, probably clothes that had been purchased or made specifically for this purpose. The photographer would have used a support stand, hidden carefully to position the body naturally. Elena felt tears welling in her eyes. Why did Dorothy keep this photograph all her life but never talk about it? Grief, Margaret said simply. Sometimes people carry losses so deep they can't speak them aloud. Elena knew that if she wanted to truly understand this family's story, she needed to find living descendants. She began building a family tree, starting with what she knew. Catherine O'Brien had married Joseph Brennan in 1918 and had a daughter, Dorothy, in 1920. But had Thomas and William married? Did they have children who might still be alive? Using online genealogy databases and old city directories, Elena traced Thomas O'Brien's life. He had married in 1922 to a woman named Rose, and they had 3 children. One of those children, a son named Patrick, had lived in Pittsburgh his entire life and died in 2019. But Patrick had 2 daughters, and Elena was able to locate one of them through social media. Her name was Claire Thompson, age 63, living in the suburb of Fox Chapel. Elena sent her a carefully worded message explaining her research and asking if Claire would be willing to talk about her grandfather Thomas and his family. 2 days later, Claire responded with her phone number and an invitation to visit. Claire's home was a comfortable ranch house surrounded by maple trees. She welcomed Elena warmly, offering coffee and leading her to a living room filled with family photographs covering the walls and mantelpiece. "I'm so glad you reached out," Claire said, settling into an armchair. "I've always wanted to know more about my grandfather's early life. He rarely talked about his childhood." Elena showed Claire the photograph from 1910. Claire stared at it for a long moment, her hand moving to her mouth. "That's my grandfather," she whispered, pointing to Thomas. "He would have been about 12 there. I've never seen him this young." "Did he ever mention his brothers?" Elena asked gently. "William and James?" Claire nodded slowly. "He mentioned William occasionally. I know they stayed close throughout their lives. William moved to Ohio in the 1930s, worked in manufacturing. They wrote letters." She paused, her gaze fixed on the smallest boy in the photograph. "But I never heard him mention anyone named James. Not once." Elena explained what she had discovered about the photograph, about James's death from diphtheria in 1910, about the post-mortem photography tradition. Claire listened with tears streaming down her face. "He carried this grief his whole life and never spoke of it," she said. "That must have been such a weight to bear." Claire's revelation drove Elena to dig deeper into Frederick Westfield's studio records. If the photographer had kept any logs or notes from 1910, they might provide additional context about the O'Brien family and the circumstances of the portrait. She contacted the Historical Society's extensive collection of business records, and after days of searching, found what she was looking for: 3 leather-bound ledgers from the Westfield Portrait Studio, covering the years 1908 to 1912. The ledgers were remarkably detailed. Westfield had recorded not just the names of clients and prices charged, but often brief notes about the circumstances of each sitting. Elena carefully turned the fragile pages, protected by her conservator's gloves, scanning through entries from early 1910. Then, in March of that year, she found it. March 19th, 1910, O'Brien family, memorial portrait. Mother requested the boys be photographed together. Payment, $3.50. Reduced rate given circumstances. Note: position youngest boy in chair. Brothers standing attendance. Mother too distraught to be present. Father waited outside studio. Difficult sitting. Older boys very brave. Elena read the entry 3 times, each word adding texture to her understanding of that day. Mary O'Brien, devastated by the loss of her youngest child just 2 days earlier, had wanted her 3 sons photographed together one final time. But she couldn't bear to be in the studio for the session itself. Patrick had waited outside, probably unable to watch his dead son being posed for a photograph. and Thomas and William, 12 and 9 years old, had stood beside their deceased brother and remained composed long enough for the photograph to be taken. "Older boys, very brave," Westfield had written. Elena imagined what that must have cost them, what strength it required to stand there, knowing this would be the last image of their brother. She found another note in the margin, added in different ink, perhaps days later. "Mrs. O'Brien collected photograph March 24th. She held it and wept, said she would treasure it always. I did not charge her for the frame." Elena closed the ledger carefully, her vision blurred by tears. Frederick Westfield had been more than just a photographer capturing an image. He had been a compassionate witness to a family's grief, doing what he could to ease their burden in an impossible moment. Elena felt she needed one more piece of this puzzle. She needed to understand Catherine, Dorothy's mother, who had been 15 when her youngest brother died. Catherine would have been old enough to fully comprehend the loss, old enough to remember James vividly. Elena wondered if Catherine had shared those memories with her daughter Dorothy, and whether those memories explained why Dorothy had kept the photograph hidden for so many years. Through additional genealogy research, Elena discovered that Catherine Brennan had died in 1989 at age 94, outliving her husband by 12 years. She had no other children besides Dorothy. But Elena found an obituary that mentioned Catherine had been active in her church community and had volunteered at a children's hospital for decades. Following another lead, Elena contacted the church Catherine had attended, St. Anthony's in the North Side. The current pastor connected her with an elderly parishioner named Loretta who had known Catherine well. They met at a small cafe near the church on a gray December afternoon. Loretta was 91 years old, sharp-minded and thoughtful. "Catherine was one of the kindest women I ever knew," she said, stirring sugar into her tea. "She had this gentle way about her, especially with children. She volunteered in the pediatric ward at the hospital for over 30 years. "Did she ever talk about her own childhood?" Elena asked. "Her brothers?" Loretta's expression grew distant, remembering. "Only once, and I knew her for 40 years. It was in the 1970s, I think. We were working together at a hospital fundraiser, and a young boy in the ward had died unexpectedly. Catherine had to step outside. I found her in the hallway, crying. She told me about her little brother James, how he'd died when she was 15, how she'd never gotten over it." Elena leaned forward. "What else did she say?" "She said that James had been the sweetest child, always laughing and asking questions. She said watching him die from diphtheria, watching him struggle to breathe, knowing there was nothing anyone could do, had broken something in her family that never quite healed. Her mother, Mary, became very withdrawn after James died. Her father worked longer hours at the mill. Her brothers Thomas and William became very quiet, very serious." Loretta paused, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "Catherine said she made a choice after James died. She decided to dedicate herself to caring for sick children, to try to save others the way she couldn't save her brother." Elena spent Christmas week writing a comprehensive report on her research. She documented every detail of the O'Brien family's story, from James's death in March 1910 to Dorothy's passing in 2024, spanning over a century of grief, resilience, and love. The post-mortem photograph was not just a historical artifact. It was a testament to a family's determination to preserve memory despite devastating loss. She contacted Claire Thompson again, this time inviting her to the Historical Society. When Claire arrived, Elena presented her with carefully made copies of the photograph, Westfield's ledger entry, and all the research she had compiled. Claire stood in the archive room, reading through the documents with tears flowing freely. "My grandfather carried this grief silently for 90 years, Claire said. "He died in 2002 and I never knew. William, James, the photograph, all of it was locked away inside him." She looked at the image of the three brothers. But he loved his brothers. You can see it in how he's standing, trying to be strong for James one last time. Elena made arrangements for the photograph to be professionally restored and preserved. She wrote an article for the Pennsylvania Historical Journal about post-mortem photography, using the O'Brien brothers as a case study while respecting the family's privacy. The article examined how such photographs served as crucial emotional artifacts for families who had few other ways to preserve memories of lost children. Claire requested that the original photograph be displayed in the Historical Society's collection, with a placard explaining James's story and honoring the O'Brien family's experience. The display opened on March 17, 2025, exactly 115 years after James's death. On opening day, Elena stood beside Claire as visitors moved through the exhibit. Many stopped at the photograph of the three brothers, reading the explanation, studying the impossible angle of James's fingers, understanding what they were witnessing. Some wept. Others stood in silent contemplation. An elderly woman approached Elena, her voice soft. "My grandmother had a photograph like this of her baby brother. She kept it her whole life in a velvet box. I never understood why until now." Elena realized then that the O'Brien brothers' photograph had transcended its original purpose. It was no longer just a memorial for one family, but a connection point for countless families who had experienced similar losses, who had preserved similar photographs, who had carried similar grief across generations. James, who had lived only 6 years, now served as a reminder of every child lost too soon, every family that found ways to hold on to love even in the face of death. The photograph remained exactly what it had always been: 3 brothers together, 2 living and 1 gone, frozen in a moment of love that refused to fade even after a century of silence.